In this module, we'll take a look at the Metasploit MSF directory. We'll take a look at the actual Metasploit directory itself. This is sometimes referred to as the Metasploit framework directory. We'll look at generating some documentation based on the information that's there. Obviously, you can go online and read the documentation, but it's often nice to have it locally available to you. And then we'll look at utilizing what's called the Metasploit search command to allow us to find payloads and exploits. Just some extra bits and pieces to help us get familiar with Metasploit. So first off, let's talk about the directories. There are two core Metasploit locations. One is MSF, and it's actually a .msf. It's a hidden file location. And the second one is the Metasploit directory, or often referred to as Metasploit framework, which exists on the system, depending whether it's Windows or Linux. For the purposes of this module, we'll be using a Linux machine to be able to traverse through the files and the folders. Inside those core directories are subdirectories that will contain the modules, the auxiliaries, and the payloads, as well as a whole bunch of other stuff that's part of the core building blocks of Metasploit. If we look at the .msf4 directory, the hidden one, this contains history, logs, loot, modules, plugins, and ultimately the connection to the database. The history file and the logs, for example, will contain a history of all the things that you've done, as well as any error logs that need to happen and be generated. The loot folder, so let's say you break into a target machine, you implement a keylogger, the keylogger will actually write its values into the loot directory. And the modules and the plugins are the places where you can create your custom methods, functions, whatever you want to call them, in order to be used inside Metasploit. Now, if we go to the Metasploit directory, this is where the core components that make up Metasploit. So we have, for example, modules, plugins, tools, libraries. If we go a little bit deeper into the modules folder, you'll see that it's broken down into exploits, and then exploits is broken into the operating system or the device or the type that the module is connected to. We can also look inside the modules folder, and there'll be a payloads directory. Inside there, it's grouped into three areas: singles, stages, and stages. Different varying types of payloads for different types of operating systems or applications. We can also go further into the auxiliary folder, and this is where we can access auxiliary components or services. So for example, we have the scanner folder. Inside the scanner, it will contain SQL scanners, or it will contain ARP scanners. There's lots and lots of different auxiliary components that once we have created a session to a machine, that we can actually run these auxiliary components. Now, if I wanted to navigate to the Metasploit framework directory, I can actually utilize a cd command, and I can use opt metasploit. Remember, that's the Linux location. And then there's three subdirectories: apps, pro, and msf3. The msf3 is actually a link folder that takes us to another location, which is the one that's listed below for generating documentation, and we'll go through the steps to do this. We can navigate to the Metasploit framework location. We can ensure that yard is installed. By default, it may not be, so we can do an apt-get space install space yard, and that will install this yard component that's used for generating documentation. We then utilize Python to spin up a HTTP server, and then I should be able to browse to the URL, and we then should see documentation from the Rails files that have been created for Metasploit. If I wanted to browse through the modules, and we'll do this in a moment, I can go into the folder structure and navigate through. I can then also utilize the search command to allow me to search for different types, whether it's an exploit or a payload, by specific platforms, because that list can be quite lengthy. So it means that we're able to restrict or narrow down that list by using the search command. So let's get straight into it. Let's look at the MSF directory. Let's look at the Metasploit directory, and then let's look at using some search commands. Okay, so here we are back at our Linux machine. I'm going to make sure that I boot up MSF console or Metasploit first. This should take a moment to load. What we'll also then do is launch another terminal, and in this one we'll actually navigate the structure using standard cd commands. So first off, I'm going to choose cd, opt, and Metasploit, and then we'll use the ls command to list out what exists in that structure. So when we did the base install, this is where the components went into. You'll see that we have various components. We have reset password, we have reconfigure scripts, we have create users. These are all commands that we can run. They're all shell commands. What we're going to do though is focus on going into the apps directory. And if I just list in here, you'll see we have a pro directory. And if I then list, you'll see that it's now broken even further. So in here, you can see that we have a data folder, we have modules, we have scripts, we have reports and plugins. But more importantly, we have the MSF3, which is where everything runs. So I'm going to choose MSF3 and then choose ls for list. Once again, we get a broke down structure. We've got config, data, db, modules, plugins. So let me just clear this back out. And then let's go into modules and we'll list this out. So when I access the modules, I can see auxiliary, encoders, exploits, NOPS, payloads, post. So if I go into exploits and then do ls again, you'll see we have that breakdown. So I'm going to go into C Windows and do ls again. And you'll see now that for Windows specifically, I'm able to find exploits for everything from antivirus to email to proxy servers to VPNs to Telnet. And if I wanted to go and see what they were, I could actually go in and pick SMB, for example. And then I get the actual list of the exploits. And these are the Rails files, the .rb files that actually contain the code. So for example, if I choose nano and then choose psexec.rb, this will then load me the source code, and you can see it's just standard code. It tells you what it's supposed to do, and you can trawl through. Most importantly, it gives you the references to the CVE issues, which if there's a website, CVE details, that you can go to, and then contains all of the code. Now, we're not going to make changes to this, so let me just come out of that. But that gives you an idea of how it's kind of structured. We have breakdowns of subdirectories, ultimately to get down to the Rails folders. Now, let me just go back through a couple. And what we'll do is we'll go to root, and then we'll go to the hidden MSF4 directory, and then I'll just clear it so we can see what's in there. So here we have the hidden directory, the .msf4. This is where we have modules, plugins, loot, logs. So if I go into logs and then list that out, we can see that we have the framework log, production log, and then we have session logs. So when we create a session, there's logs that get generated. If we were, as I mentioned before, if we had a connection, there we go. I previously did one where we were doing a downloading keylogger information, and this is where this generated my file. So if I go to nano and just choose that file, you can see that there's a password in there, there's an account in there, and a domain admin group. So whatever was on that machine, I captured that information. And this information, it gets stored in the loot folder. And then of course, if I come back out, I can go into the modules folder, and you'll see there's nothing in those. I can also come back out and then go into plugins and list those out, and those are empty, because these are the locations where you can define your own, and they get added into the core Metasploit framework. Now, one of the things that's useful is having the ability to access core documentation for Metasploit. So what we can do is we can browse to the actual Metasploit framework directory. And what I'm able to do now is choose yard and doc. What this will do, this is now going to iterate through all of the Rails files and generate documentation so that we're then able to access that locally on our virtual machine. Okay, so it's now completed. As you can see, there are some errors. Some of the items didn't get documented, and that's purely based on the fact that using Yard, not everything will get documented exactly as it should do. As you can see, some of the errors are about resolving links to information and understanding some of the text in those. But that gives us a pretty good setup of information. Now what we can do is, if we minimize our window here and our MSF console, and we can go into our directories, if we go into our file system and we navigate to that structure that we generated, so users share, and then go down to the Metasploit framework, and if we click in our doc folder, you'll see that everything that was generated is generated here, so all of our pages. You'll see that we can take the index.html, and I can just open with the browser, and the index.html page is obviously the home page or the first page of that documentation, so this should load any second. And there we have our documentation. So we can access this using just opening the HTML pages. But of course, that means I need to know all the links and how to get backs and forwards. So if we go back to our console application and go back to here where we've got user share Metasploit framework, and if I want to go ahead and use Python, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll just clear this and put it up here. Python-m simple HTTP server. What this will do is this then sets up a website that listens on port 8000 inside that directory. So what I'm going to do here is remove all of this. HTTP 127.0.0.1/doc index.html. Oh, forgot the port on the end. Important. And there we have the documentation. So this is generated documentation using Yard for everything that exists inside Metasploit. I'm actually able to click methods list, and if you leave that for a second, it should come back with the search option and allow me to start typing through the method list itself. I can look at the class list and the files list. So this means that I'm actually able to have a localized version of this on my machine. So if I just minimize that, you can see that everything that gets loaded is served up in our little simple HTTP server. So I'm going to close that down and I'll just clear that out. Now, of course, if we go to our actual Metasploit console, that window that we have open, what we can do here is, remember that we learned about using the use command. I can actually do exploit Windows SMB psexec, and that's the location that we looked at in the regular window, which was Metasploit framework, modules, exploit, Windows, SMB, and then psexec existed as one of those options that's there. So we're able to do a one-to-one mapping between the commands that we use in Metasploit and the structure within the Metasploit framework. Now, if we wanted to, we could actually utilize search, and I'm going to choose platform, and what we'll do is we'll look for Windows 7 SP1, and we'll specify the type as exploit. So I'm now telling it to do a search. It's going to build me a cache of all the information, but it's going to look for Windows 7 SP1 as the platform with a type of exploit. Now this can take a few minutes to run, it can take a few seconds, and there we go. This is everything that's Windows 7 related. Now if I wanted to change that and my target wasn't Windows, then what I could do is just change that and say, show me everything that's Ubuntu and is a type of exploit. Same process occurs, it builds the cache and will then return the values related to platform of Ubuntu with a type of exploit. And there we have them returned. Now we can change this. If I go in and remove the platform option I could simply use type and choose payload. This will do the same thing as the exploit, but go and find me just the payloads that I'm able to look for. So using the search option, I'm able to find exploits, I'm able to find payloads or modules or whatever I'm trying to find. Remember that when we wrote the syntax help search, this allows me to use certain keywords. I've only used type and platform, but I could use something else. I could search by a CVE, an ID number, by going to cvedetails.com, looking for the exploit and finding the one that's there. As you see in the example, it says search CVE 2009 type exploit app client. So this is a quick way to be able to find the types of modules, exploits, payloads, whatever you're looking for, or even auxiliary services that are available.